Good evening, everyone. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's reading by A.S. Byatt. She will be introduced and then interviewed by David Ebershoff. On behalf of the Poetry Center, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank some of our seasoned supporters. The Greenwood family, the National Endowment for the Arts, Eva Eusdan, Joan and Jack Jacobson, the Kaplan Foundation, Amazon, and the New York State Council on the Arts. Following Ms. Byatt's reading, which will last about 40 minutes, she will sit for a conversation with Mr. Ebershoff. She has also agreed to answer questions from the audience. You should have received an index card in your printed program. If you have a question, please write it down and pass it to one of the ushers. Afterward, we invite you all to join us for a reception and book signing in the art gallery just next door. Books by both authors will be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Barnes & Noble. The next event in our main reading series will take place on Monday, November 9th, when Orhan Pamuk will read from his work. Mr. Pamuk will be reading from The Museum of Innocence, his first novel since winning the Nobel Prize in 2006, and it's his first visit to the Poetry Center. David Ebershoff is the author of 4 books of fiction: The Danish Girl, The Rose City, Pasadena, and The 19th Wife. He has won a number of awards, including the Rosenthal Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Lambda Literary Award, and the Farrah Grumley Award for Excellence in Gay and Lesbian Literature. His books have been translated into 16 languages, and 2 are being adapted for the screen. At present, he teaches at Columbia University and serves as editor-at-large for Random House. Please welcome David Ebershoff as he introduces A.S. Byatt.
Thank you, Bernard, for those nice words, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight to welcome A.S. Byatt to New York and to celebrate her latest novel, The Children's Book. Several years ago, on this very stage, Antonia Byatt told the story of someone once asking her how she knew so much, how she seemed to be an expert of so many topics, from insects to Venetian glass to utopian political theory to romantic poetry to Richard Burton to the Brothers Grimm. "I read," Antonia replied simply. "I read." It's this act of reading, this vast gobbling of criticism and history and poetry and art theory and architecture and military minutiae and fables and fairy tales that begins to explain why we read A.S. Byatt. I first got to know Antonia about a decade ago. Our relationship established itself through reading. At the time, I was the publishing director of the Modern Library, the classics imprint at Random House. Antonia served as a member of our editorial board, a position in which she informally advised me on books to add to our list. She would call me up from London, and we would talk about Charlotte Bronte's Villette, or early James versus late James, or the legacy of Daniel Deronda. Sorry. It would be untruthful to suggest to you that I was always capable of holding up my end of the dialogue. Sometimes my phone would ring and I would hear Antonia's distinctly warm but firm voice ask, "Have you an opinion of the fiction of Rebecca West?" Or, "Have you an opinion of Northrop Frye?" In some cases, these questions would send me to the books, giving me unmatched hours with The Return of the Soldier or The Fountain Overflows. In other cases, I will admit, I never quite finished my homework. Poor Northrop Frye, I confess, he has grown dusty on my uppermost shelf. Even so, I recall that more than a few times, these conversations turned to the golden age of children's literature in Britain: Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Wind in the Willows, and Peter Pan. I believe it was Antonia who first told me that Peter Pan had in fact first appeared as a children's story woven into a novel written for adults called The Little White Bird, which is why I wasn't surprised and more than a little delighted to find mention of Peter Pan's origins in Antonia's latest novel, The Children's Book. As you might know, at the novel's heart is a writer named Olive Wellwood, a very successful author of children's literature in the 19th century and early 20th. We follow Olive's complex relationships with her husband, her lover, her writing, and her children. And then we follow her children as they grow up and assert themselves just as the cultural, economic, and political forces of the 20th century are asserting themselves with all their violence and promises of liberty. Rising up in this vast narrative, like a few great white oaks in a dark forest, are the children's stories Olive has written privately for her children, tales with titles like Tom Underground and The People in the House in the House. These stories, of course, are Byatt's stories, lifted from her imagination and dropped into what is surely one of her greatest novels. I recall a story Antonia has told about writing her novel Possession. She said that she did not know what to do about the Victorian poetry her characters were so driven by. Should she quote Browning or Rossetti? Her editor at the time told her that she must write the poems herself. Anything else would not do. I thought of this often while reading the children's book, thinking how Antonia must have reminded herself of this advice as she penned the children's stories that make this novel both uniquely ambitious and terribly exciting to read. Throughout her career, across 15 novels and story collections and 7 books of criticism, Antonia's work has shared a common trait I will call bigness, a lumpy word, I realize, for something so magnificent and rare. Antonia isn't interested in the small, unless the small can reveal something large about ourselves and our world. She recognizes that we turn to literature for clues about life's largest matters: love, family, art, death, myth, legacy, redemption. In 1990, Antonia forged this bigness into blazing form in Possession. The novel won the Booker Prize and went on to influence a generation of novelists, including myself, interested in the intersection of fiction and history. I'm not the first person to compare the children's book to Possession, to argue that both novels showcase this sense of bigness at work. Recently, the children's book was a finalist for the Booker Prize, and I suspect it too will go on to influence many writers in the coming years. Just as important, the children's book, like all of Antonia's fiction, casts a spell over the reader, possessing him or her to frantically turn the page. And this might be her greatest power. Her obsessions become ours. Through the magical forces of her words, Antonia gloriously and generously shares her lifetime of reading, a gift we can only accept with gratitude and praise. Please help me welcome Antonia Byatt.
I should like to thank David for that generous introduction, and my mind always runs on precise things. I remember trying to convince him that the Modern Library would really like to republish Harriet Beecher Stowe's failed masterpiece, Dread, but I don't think it ever did, and I still think it should. It's an amazing and wonderful book. I'm going to read 2 passages this evening from the children's book, one of them a bit longer and one of them a bit shorter. The first one takes up Olive when she's writing a children's story somewhere between the private stories she writes for her children and the public stories she publishes. A woman who writes a book with a secret story for each of her children is both giving them a wonderful gift and also, as it were, insinuating herself into their private reading self. This is a very ambiguous relationship, though done on her part with entire goodwill. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is that this is a novel, although I'm starting with the children's story writer, with an increasing number of central characters, of centres of consciousness, as Henry James would have said. And starting with Olive, doesn't mean she is, in any conventional sense, the central character. I don't think I need to explain anything else, except perhaps that at this point where she begins to write, she is already some months pregnant. All writers, perhaps, have talismanic phrases which represent to them the force, the intrinsic nature of writing. Olive's was from the ballad tale of True Thomas, who had been taken under the hill by the Queen of Elfland. For 40 days and 40 nights he waded through red blood to the knee, and he saw neither sun nor moon, but heard the roaring of the sea. She wanted to write that, the wading through blood, the absence of sun and moon and the roaring of the sea, but she had never done so, for her tales, though they were getting darker and stranger, were meant to be for children. There was a proliferation of Christian stories at that time about the exemplary deaths of little children, looking upwards to the skipping little angels in the fluffy clouds of heaven. But there was nothing like red blood to the knee. She thought briefly about the coming birth, the blood that would flood, the pain that would gripe, the possibility that the emerging stranger on the flood of blood would be mottled, waxy and inert, a tight-lidded doll like Rosie. She knew about amniotic fluid. The unborn creature did not really float in blood, but blood went to it, her blood, down a livid rope that could give life or could strangle. These things were not spoken of or written about. They were, therefore, more real and more unreal, intensely, simultaneously. She needed to keep writing. Toad Fright's continuance depended on it. Her husband, Humphrey, who had just left the Bank of England, had sold several articles on the South African landlords, on poverty in the East End, on the desirability of the public ownership of all land. He was giving courses of lectures in Manchester and Tunbridge Wells and Whitechapel, one of them on Shakespeare's England, one on local government, and one on the history of Britain. He was happy, but he was earning much less than his salary at the bank. And he was away for days and weeks together. Olive imagined young women staring at him from hard chairs in municipal halls, as she and her sister Violet had stared. She was in two minds about this. She did not like to be touched when pregnant, and felt practically that there was something to be said for Humphrey being distracted. But there was always the risk of a little more than distraction, a public scandal, a wavering of his love, a threat to the safe house. Oops. I've never spilt any yet. When she had no ideas for stories, she turned half reluctantly to the secret tales that belonged to Tom, Dorothy, Phyllis, and Hedda, rewriting bits of them in easier, public forms, rounded off and simplified. There was no stated understanding that the secret and private should be inviolate. Tales are tales, Olive told herself, endlessly retold and reforming themselves, like severed worms or branching rivers of water and metal. The children's tales contain things taken from other storytellers. Her own True Thomas met the Queen of Elfland in her skirt of grass-green silk, and a sinister mole in Dorothy's world of shape-shifting animals owed much to Olive's own excited childhood fear of Andersen's Thumbelina. There were passages she wrote and rewrote, sometimes changing them radically, sometimes hardly altering a word. One of the beginnings of Tom Underground had been written some time after the original beginning, which had been the meeting with the Elfland Queen. Maybe she could use it to make a saleable tale, and Tom would grimace, and she would say it was not the same tale, and would confide in him, woman to man, about the terrors of the cash flow. She took up her pen and began writing on a new sheet. Blood flowed from heart to head and into the happy fingertips, bypassing the greedy inner sleeper. She would begin with the baby. Sometimes the baby in the tale was a royal prince, and sometimes a sturdy son of a miner. Today she settled for the prince. There was once a baby prince, much longed for and much loved, who, perhaps because he was so slow to arrive in the waiting palace, was believed by everyone to be flawlessly beautiful and wonderfully clever. He had a pleasant disposition, though he could easily have been spoilt, and was good at amusing himself when left alone, which of course was rare, except at night. There was a guard outside his night nursery, for the usual malign fairy had said that something would be stolen from him. His name was Lancelin, Olive wrote, and crossed it out and wrote it again, as she could not think of anything better or different. At night, Lancelin's nursery transformed itself, as most nurseries do, into a cavern of shadows. Shadows are mysterious things. They are real and unreal. They have colour and no colour. When the moon shone in through the stone windows, she lit up certain things partially. Lancelin had a rattle in the form of a horned and bearded godling, below whose waist a line of carved goatskin became a mother-of-pearl handle, which Lancelin clasped. The godling's arms were outstretched, and at his fingertips dangled strings of little bells, gold and silver like metal bubbles, and in the moonlight these became quite other metals, moon metals, glinting and slaty. Lancelin liked to hold up the mannequin and twist him to and fro in the cold light, and the little bells rang out, and Lancelin saw the shadow of his own arm on the four walls, with the shadow of the toy in its insubstantial fingers. He would make this other self bigger and smaller, longer and shorter against the white quilt, or wavering over the rails of his crib. He could make a thicker, darker figure, drawing all the dark into itself, squat on the counterpane, or an elongated, ash-grey, gesticulating demon holding the room in its arms. It was eyeless, mouthless, sliced into strips by the bars of the cot. He could multiply himself and wave his hands to his shadow hands, which waved back. There were other shadows in the night nursery with which the fearless baby offered to play. Shadows lurking in dark hollows between pieces of furniture which could be imagined, if you twisted your head so the moonlight caught on a gilt doorknob, to have shining eyes in the dark. Or there were tall, still forms who stood in corners and could be seen and seen through. You may think it is unusual for a boy not to be frightened of shadows. We all see dangerous faces in knots of wood in wardrobe doors, and witches in the shadows of branches on the ceiling, waving in the wind, stretching out long grasping fingers. But he was not frightened, which makes what occurred all the more shocking. Something moved in the dark of the corner of the room by the skirting board. Lancelin watched it and laughed, but he could not change its shape by moving his head, and after a bit it began to move forwards, and he saw that the dark was solid. It was sleek and it was shining. It had colourless dark fur that reflected the moonlight. It had small, pale feet with sharp claws and a quivering snout with whiskers, and a long, pale, hairless tail that thumped and slithered behind it. Its eyes had little crimson centres that glowed. It came on, and Lancelin prepared to welcome it. He liked new friends. It stood up on its haunches and made a little leap between the bars of his crib and squatted at his feet. Lancelin made a questioning noise. The creature opened its mouth, showing rows of needle-sharp yellow-white teeth. It lowered its head and began to bite and to rip. It was ripping away not at the pretty white quilt with its embroidered flowers, but at the invisible seams where Lancelin's shadow touched the soles of his feet and the tips of his fingers. He could have touched the soft fur of its busy head, but he was afraid of the sharp teeth and afraid of the scissoring sound they made. It paid no attention to Lancelin himself. When it had worked its way all round the shadow, it rolled it up with little kneading and rolling movements of its paws into a tiny bundle. Then it took up the bundle and jumped softly out of the crib and into the dark. Lancelin raised his arm in the moonlight. It cast no grey shape anywhere. It was as though he himself was not there. Here, Olive came to the point where she had stopped the last time and could not think what might happen next. She needed neat narrative as opposed to the endless flow of Tom's underground river. The baby could not follow the rat into the dark. What would the king and queen and court make of a child without a shadow? She vaguely remembered that there were existing fairy tales about lost shadows. Why was it frightening to have no second self, to cast no shade? She saw vaguely that she had made the baby so smiling and self-confident because that was an image of shadowless singularity. He might become one of those protected beings who weren't allowed out because they were vulnerable, like Sleeping Beauty, who must not see spindles, like the Buddha, protected from disease and death. He lived in perpetual noonday, which was intolerable. He would have to go down the rat hole, no two ways about it. He would have to go into the world of shadows to retrieve his own. She imagined a kingdom of rats with human shadows mocking a questing infant. A helper was needed, a dog, a cat, a worm. No, though that was subtle and subterranean. A magic snake, maybe. Snakes ate rats. She could not think what to write next. At that precise moment, a relief and a terror to writers, she heard the wheels of the station fly on the gravel. Humphrey was back. She wrote a sentence. At first, the king, queen, and courtiers noted only that Lancelin was even more beautiful, sunny, and smiling than they remembered. And then this singularity of grace began to be alarming. Always leave writing in medias res was a rule she had learnt. She put away her writing pad and went downstairs to greet her errant husband. As often happened, Violet had got there first, was helping with his overcoat, had taken possession of his book bag and umbrella. He kissed Olive and made a joke about her girth, which did not please her. He went into his own study to look at his letters. There was a considerable heap of them, some a week or two old, some arrived yesterday. Olive sat in a rush-back chair in the corner of his study. She was disinclined to go back to her interrupted work and mildly resentful of the interruption. Humphrey read the letters, smiling to himself. He put them back in the envelopes, except the bills. Then he came to one out of which a press cutting fell. Humphrey read and was frozen. Olive asked what was the matter, and Humphrey handed her the cutting. Slit throat at train terminus. Financier found dead. For a moment, Olive thought Humphrey's brother Basil had killed himself. Humphrey's violent reaction suggested something as grave as that. It was not Basil. It was Frederick Oliver Heath, aged 38, a member of the Stock Exchange, who had been unable to sleep for the past 3 weeks owing to trouble caused by heavy monetary losses. Olive said, "Did you know him?" No, but I knew he was in trouble with Kaffirs. I know several things that most people don't yet know. I am sure, I have always been sure, that Basil is too deep in Barnato's muck, except that muck is too solid a word. It's murk, a murky cloud of obfuscation and prestidigitation and rope tricks and promises never meant to be kept. Basil won't have sold, partly because he won't want to admit that I might have been right. I know Basil. I must telegraph him. I'll take the pony trap. Forgive me, my dear, when I've only just come in. Humphrey was both genuinely distressed and taking energy and pleasure from the drama. He strode out, calling to Violet to get the man to harness the pony to fetch his coat. Olive sat in Humphrey's study and pondered the useful words muck and murk. Rats were mucky and murky. Briefly, her mind revisited and shied away from her brother Petey and Petey's tale of rats in mines eating candles and the men's snap. She began to tidy Humphrey's papers and cast an eye over the letter he had been smiling to himself over. It began, "My very dear." She looked at the signature. "You're no longer a maid, Marion." "I am not a fool," Olive said to herself. "It is much more sensible not to read this, which is not addressed to me." She read it. "My very dear, you have been gone for so short a time, and yet already everything, the whole world, is quite another place, emptier and fuller. I truly do not know who I was or how I lived before I first saw and heard you. The woman I now am came into being as you spoke about the lovely equality of the bantering lovers in Much Ado About Nothing, about how a man and a woman can love and not know they love, and how very rarely lovers in plays and stories are at ease with each other. I thought I would teach my students that wisdom, and did not see until too late, blessedly too late, how my deepest desire was to be at ease in that way with you. You, your very self. If I fought your ideas in public, it was only in search of that ease where anything may be said. And when you said other things, when I felt myself personally valued, and for the first time, however illusorily, however guardedly, to be beautiful and desired, I became your slave and will remain your slave. Though I cannot imagine you wanting to play master. You were a friend first and a lover second, and I am shining with joy. I wrote as far as this yesterday, my darling. I did not say I was feeling unwell while you were here, for I wanted not to waste one moment of our secret and precarious time. But I was unwell, and now I know the cause, the most natural of all, and truly a matter of rejoicing, for me at least. I am to be a mother. I ask for nothing, no help, no advice. I am an independent woman and trust to remain so. If all goes well and we can continue to be at ease with each other in these new circumstances, I should like my child to know his father in some way, though never to ask for any material thing. Oh, my very dear, of course I am afraid, but I am also resourceful and will put no burden on you, believe me, only a prayer that if it can conveniently happen, we may continue to see each other. You're no longer a maid, Marion." Olive refolded this document and said, "Damn," several times. This was bad, very bad. This was a woman who was a somebody, not a frivolous bit of skirt. This was a person not unlike Olive, to whom Humphrey was real, and who was, as she said, at ease with him, which must mean that he in turn was at ease with her. Some sort of teacher who had heard him talk on Shakespeare. Someone to whom he indubitably owed something, despite her disclaimers and his financial position. "Damn," said Olive again, beginning to be angry, stoking an inner flame. Damn and damn. She was quite sincerely worried about the predicament in which this strange woman found herself. Humphrey must of course offer help. It was his duty. She knew only too well the special feeling he gave of being comfortable and at ease with women. It was what she loved in him herself. She thought it went with one kind of promiscuous love-making, rarer than the Don Juan with his sequential conquests, the man who found women truly interesting. If Humphrey had come home at that moment, she would have embraced him, perhaps, and smiled ruefully, and made sure of her own charm and her own central place in his affections, which she had never really had cause to doubt. But Humphrey did not come home, and Olive's mood veered into grievance. She began, almost vindictively, to read the other letters on the desk, and discovered 2 rejected articles. A very clever analysis, but so opinionated that I can't quite see it as an expression of the beliefs of our journal. Very interesting as always, but I am afraid we have no room for articles of such limited appeal to the general public. Olive felt threatened. She should be earning money with her little prince and her sinister fat rat, not standing here waiting to discuss peccadillos or worse. Toad fright was threatened. Olive said, "Damn." By the time Humphrey came in, she was like a humming top, spinning with wrath. He was followed by Violet, gathering up his coat and hat. "I have sent a telegram," he said. "I think I must go and see Basil. I am absolutely certain I know dangerous things he does not know. I'll wait for an answer to my telegram and then set off. This will have far-reaching and terrible consequences if Barnato's nets are unravelling, and I know it is not if, it is when." "You can go and see Marion," said Olive. "Don't be silly, she's in Manchester," said Humphrey, preoccupied with gold mines and brothers. He saw what he had been led to betray and took in his wife and the dissipated heap of letters. He smiled his foxy, intent smile, interested in Olive's reaction. "Touché," he said. "You of all women should know better than to read private papers. It's not serious, you know that. Nothing to do with you and me, which is why you shouldn't stoop to reading private papers." He put out a hand to caress her, and Olive slapped it down. "It is to do with me. It is deeply to do with me. We shall lose toad fright unless we earn some money and don't do things which create more dependent mouths. I work and work. I have to keep toad fright going by myself, and I am sick and anxious and should be resting." "Money," said Humphrey. "Money or sex relations? Which comes first? Which is more certain to cause arguments and harm marriages? An interesting problem." "It isn't an interesting problem, it's my life," cried Olive. Up to that point, it had not been clear to either of them whether a monstrous row was going to happen or could be avoided. Now it was clear that it was to happen. It had to be gone through with. Olive clasped her hands round the unborn infant and began to shout like an operatic fishwife. Humphrey could have tried to calm or apologize. In any case, he had to abandon his attitude of detached amusement and calm certainty. He was never defensive. When threatened, he attacked. "Listen to yourself," he said. "How can a grown-up woman make such a racket? I thought you had become a civilized being, but no such thing. You rant like a skivvy, like a washerwoman." There were various shapes the row took, various cycles of reproach and counter-reproach, various sabre slashes at the whole fabric of the marriage. The row was long and bad. Tom and Dorothy and Phyllis stood on the stairs, listening, ready to scurry up to the bedrooms before they were caught. They heard the sentences they always heard. "I have always tried to love all your children equally. You cannot say I have not. It has not been easy, though you may think it has. You do not thank me." I might say the same. You cannot claim I distinguish your children from my own. All of them have their place, equally. You must admit that. I shall stop there. And I should perhaps say it took me weeks to think up that bit of dialogue, which gives away something but not everything. The next bit I want to read is about a quite different character, who is one of the ones I feel closest to. A a working-class boy called Phillip Warren, who is discovered in the first chapter of the novel hiding absolutely filthy in the basement of what is to be the Victoria and Albert Museum. And he's run away from his family because he wants to make a good pot. He doesn't want to be a great artist. He wants to make a good pot. He's a totally single-minded boy, and it's cost him a bit to run away from his family. He is taken up by Olive and her family and goes to live in the southern counties in the family of a slightly mad but certainly great potter called Benedict Flood, where he learns to make pots and is paid no wages and sort of subsists. This little passage takes place when he's going on a walk across the Romney Marshes, past a church to which I have become very attached, which is the Church of St. Thomas a Becket, which is so deep in the marshes that quite often it appears to be simply floating on water when the sea comes in. Philip walked to his favourite marsh church, the diminutive brick-built church of St. Thomas Becket near Fairfield. Philip thought of this church as his own particular church. He knew little about Thomas Becket and did not know that the church was built on Becket lands. He had never seen a church so isolated. It stood amongst water meadows, stretching flat and far, on which for miles the fat sheep busily cropped the salty grass. There was no road leading to it, and from it no village, no high road could be seen, only the marshes and the weather. The marshes often flooded in the winter, and then the church appeared to float mysteriously on sheets of floodwater, reflected in the dark, bright surface on calm days, blustered and beaten by howling winds and spray on stormy ones. Philip made his way from tuft to tuft of the marsh grass, for it was sodden underfoot and water welled up between tussocks. When he got to the church, he looked around at the endless sky, the flat horizon, the apparently endless sheep-studded meadows, and felt peaceful. He didn't think exactly in language. He noticed things, the dabbing movement of a duck, the awkwardly beautiful, almost crippled look of the trailing legs of a flapping heron, fish squirming in mud, patterns made by the wind. He sat for a long time on a stone in the churchyard, not even thinking. Time was so slow, there was no reason ever to stand up or to move on. A figure appeared on the Fairfield path at the limit of vision. A woman in silhouette, in a skirt, with her hair bound in a scarf and what looked like a small suitcase in her hand. She stopped to lean on a gate and then walked a little way and then sank to the ground like a kind of hummock and stayed down. Philip stood up and set off across the marsh, feeling that this other person, who now shared the emptiness with him, was both an intruder and perhaps in need of help. It took him some time to reach her. During his striding, leaping, occasionally bogged approach, she did not stir. She appeared to have fainted or died. She had crumpled quite compact, her body in a ball, her face on her outstretched hand, the cardboard suitcase on the wet dust within reach. Philip knelt down. He did not want her to be dead. He took her shoulder and turned her face slightly towards him. The face was grimy, the lips slightly cracked, the eyes closed. Her nostrils and lips trembled. She was breathing. A breeze tugged at the edges of her gypsy scarf, which was more animated than she was. She was wearing a felted coat bunched over the grey skirt. Her ankles were swollen and her shoes cracked and dusty. She had walked a long way. Philip squatted beside her amongst the wayside grass and took her hand, which seemed the politest thing to do. He bent over and said in her ear gently, "Can I help?" and then, "How do you feel?" She trembled a little and stirred and opened her eyes briefly, staring out past Philip's occluded head at the sunlight. What she said, however, was his name. "Phillip Warren." Philip stiffened. "I'm looking for Phillip Warren," she said. "I keep getting lost." Philip pushed back the scarf and the hair from her face, rearranged her features in his mind's eye, and saw she was his sister, Elsie. Elsie, a year older than Philip, was the sister he loved, had found it hardest to leave. He said, "Elsie, it's me. I am Philip." "I can't see your face because of the sun. I got lost. I walked and walked and walked, and there were no people or places. What are you doing out here?" Philip felt briefly very annoyed. "What are you doing is the question. Can you sit up?" He pulled at her, no longer with respect, but with the intimacy of family. She sat up and smoothed her skirts, stretching her horrible feet in front of her. She had always been, as far as was possible, fastidious about her person and clothing. "Mum died," said Elsie. "I came to tell you." "No one wrote." "You don't put any addresses on your postcards, do you? Probably you don't want to be bothered. But I thought you ought to know Mum died. Auntie Jessie took the others, except Nellie, who's gone into service. I didn't think I could last. I didn't think I could see the year out in a house with Auntie Jessie." "What did she die of?" "Lead poisoning. That's what was always coming, and it came. She asked for you, a lot. She wanted me to give you her brushes and the Minton cup, and I've got them in that suitcase. I said I'd find you. She knew I couldn't abide to be with Auntie Jessie, and I have found you, though not where I'd have expected." She spoke with a kind of determined vehemence, her voice thick with dust and thirst. She said, "You ought not to have." She began suddenly to weep, hot little tears bursting out through her eyelids, spattering on her grey cheeks. Philip was partly trying and partly refusing to think about his mother. He half saw her, thin and stooping, and crossly shut the picture out. Elsie heard the next question. The postcard said Romney Marsh and Winchelsea. I walked to Winchelsea, and someone said if I was looking for potters, there was a madman out at somewhere called Purchase, so I set off walking there, and got lost, as you see. You'd best come back with me. Can you walk? I was walking. Aye, and you fell over. I saw you. Can you get on your feet? I shall have to. It took a long time, a rather painful time, to walk back to Purchase House. Elsie leant on Philip briefly from time to time, and then limped on, erect and full of will. She was a thin, wiry girl with high cheekbones, blue eyes, and a set mouth, not sulky, but ungiving. That was new, the hardness of her look. Philip was ashamed of his most powerful feeling. This was that he had lost something, and he was not thinking of his mother. He was thinking of his solitude. He had, through sheer willpower, broken free of the 5 towns and come to an unlikely place where no one knew who he was or what he felt, and all that mattered was that he was good at doing what he had always known he must do, making pots with his hands. If he had a sister who would spread her disparaging opinions, or just as embarrassing, her loving opinions of him amongst these people who helped him but weren't interested in his self or soul, he would have lost something, he thought. Then he thought at last, as he trudged along the lane, between hedges now, of his poor mother, who had always lost almost everything, except the skill at painting that had killed her, and the brood of children who might die or become horribly ill, and were too many for her small wage to feed, so that they grew thin and grey-skinned, like Elsie, who had a will, he said to himself, thinking furiously, as he didn't often think. Elsie had a will, and it looked quite as strong as his own. He also thought, No one paid him any money. He had nothing to give Elsie. He was going to have to beg on her behalf. It was a bad business. Thank you. Which side?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I thought I would start tonight by asking you about reading and what you read as a child.
I read all the fairy stories that are behind this book. I read almost everything because I was so ill in bed with asthma. Often I wouldn't go to school for 2 weeks because I couldn't breathe. But I could read. And I read all the fairy stories in the Lang fairy books, and I read E. Nesbit, and I read Rudyard Kipling, and I read Beatrice Potter, and I read most of Dickens and all of Jane Austen, and vast quantities of the Children's Encyclopedia and my favourite book was a book called Asgard and the Gods.
And what is that?
It was a book my mother had as a crib at Cambridge when she was studying Icelandic and ancient Norse. And it was written by somebody called Dr. Richard R. Wagner about Nordic mythology. And it was interesting. I mean, I think I must have thought about it. It was a very Germanic book. We were at war with the Germans. And I was reading this book, and it talked about the wonderful traditions of our Germanic ancestors. And it assumed that we all had the same Germanic ancestors, the British and the and it was a sort of gripping story. It had the most beautiful pictures of any book I've ever, not sentimental, but very, very complicated steel engravings of the wild host flying through the sky. And when I'd finished it, I read something else for about a week, and then I read it again. And I'm just I've been commissioned to write a myth in a series of modern versions of ancient myths that are being published.
Oh, great.
And I'm going to do Ragnarok, the Death of the Gods, straight out of Dr. Richard W. Wagner.
How old were you when you read Wagner?
Well, my view is I was about 7. I certainly read it before we went back to Sheffield after the war, which was when I was 9. But I still read it frequently.
Do you still have that same volume?
I have that same volume, but I don't pick it up because it's an heirloom and it's shredded. I have about 4 more different copies in different editions, and I read those alternately.
Early in the novel, you write this about Olive Wellwood. The fairy tale opened some trapdoor in her imagination. I assume this is true of your imagination as well. And what is it about the fairy tale that ignites the mind?
It's I've been thinking and thinking about this, and I think I'm still writing fairy tales because I'm not quite sure. But I think it's because of the opportunity of going into another world. I didn't much like stories when I was a little girl about little girls, which is how the people in the house sort of got to be thought of. I didn't like little girls and boys having breakfast and things. I liked sort of wild forests and, as you say, trapdoors and places underground and people who went east of the wind and north of the moon, and any number of those I would read. And I got to see that there were certain patterns in them, that you were partly comfortable because you expected the ending. And then I discovered Hans Christian Andersen, who is a sadist.
As I was reading the children's book, I was thinking about you and your reading, and it seemed to me that this is a book that is informed by your lifetime of reading and books, as you said, that you read early in life, and then you must have done some more reading at the time of writing this book. So what did you need to write? What did you need to learn to write this book?
I needed to learn, it sounds awful, I needed to learn the political history of Europe, because this book is set in a period about which I knew very little when I started on it, apart from the children's literature and some obvious things like D.H. Lawrence, who was my idea of British modernism.
Right.
But my father was a member of the Fabian Society, but I didn't know anything about the early Fabians. And then it got to be a book that required more and more reading. I needed to know everything about pots and not just one or two things about pots. And I started in the Victoria and Albert and didn't know what I'd let myself in for, because the history of the Victoria and Albert is a terrifying, convoluted series of episodes and buildings. And it went on rather like that. And then I got interested. There had to be Germans. And I got interested in the history of Germany and then of Munich and the history of puppetry. And it just went on and on. But I did digest it before I wrote it into the novel.
Speaking of digestion, I've heard you talk about the gestation of the gestation period of possession, and that took almost 2 decades. What was the gestation of this book?
I think I've been writing it about 7 years. Partly because I've been quite ill twice. And one of the things I like to say about this book is I came round from a life-saving operation, and there was a surgeon with his huge, big, strong hands saying, I thought you had about a week to live, and actually you had 4 hours. And his name was Wellwood. And I thought that's a jolly good name for a book about children's writers.
It's a very good name for a doctor as well, right?
Yes, exactly. I was pleased with that.
And was there a period of time of thinking it through before the composition, or...
Very. I mean, one of the things I've changed in my habits as a writer is that I don't usually start writing until I've thought it through. I write things in notebooks. I have long, complicated notebooks. I don't know about you, but I used to write 20 drafts, and now I can do with 1 good draft.
Yeah.
I'm still thinking while I'm writing the draft, but I don't start till I'm pretty sure I know what sort of a thing it is and most of what will happen.
Yeah, I'm the same way at this point in my life, because I've learned the hard way of not thinking it through and not planning it out, and how many extra drafts that leads to. I'm gonna ask you one of the questions from the audience, which is, why are so many classic books written by English women and not many by American women? P.S. Your books will be among those someday.
I'm very grateful to the asker of that question. I got into trouble once for writing in the New York Review of Books that the Americans, for some reason, produce great women poets, one after the other after the other. We don't. We have second-rate women poets, on the whole. I mean, we've got nothing, in the quality of Emily Dickinson and Marianne Moore and Elizabeth Bishop. There's nobody like that. So Americans do that. But I think it's because of the male nature of American fiction. Whereas I think British women's writing was very strong from very early on. And maybe we owe to Jane Austen what the Americans owe to Emily Dickinson, a figure who somehow freed the imaginations of many. I mean, you need to add the Brontes, I suppose, to that, but I think they were a bit freed by her. I think that may explain it. I used to love that book about love and death in the American novel, which said that the paradigm is 2 men closely bonded from 2 different races. There's no room for a woman at all in that.
Right. I've heard you say that America's great writers are Willa Cather, Edith Wharton, Toni Morrison. Is this the end of your list?
No, Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Oh, Harriet Beecher Stowe, thank you.
Toni Morrison doesn't like me to say that. But
okay.
I think she was a very great writer, and somebody will republish Dread.
I did, on your suggestion in the Modern Library. So that leads me to another question from the audience. As a lover of literature, what authors, not just contemporary, would you choose if you were teaching a course in literature?
Ooh. I think, you see, the thing is, would you choose people you want to know more about and don't know about, or just the people you would love to stay? I think I would teach Shakespeare and Wallace Stevens and George Eliot and Proust, if I was allowed to teach in a foreign language, and Dostoevsky and Chekhov. Where would I be from there? That might take up at least a semester.
Syllabus, yeah.
I was in a university where there was a great Shakespearean scholar, and none of the rest of us were ever allowed to teach Shakespeare.
Oh, I see. Yes. So you would claim that now. I want to go back to the children's book, and at the very beginning of your reading tonight, you began with this intriguing statement about writers and writing. All writers, perhaps, have talismanic phrases, which represents to them the force, the intrinsic nature of writing. Do you have a talismanic phrase?
Yes, in fact, this you see, people always look for the wrong autobiographical things. This is one of my talismanic phrases. He raged through red blood to the knee.
Oh, I see.
It makes me want to write.
Okay.
And then there are various bits of Shakespeare, including King Lear saying never, 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 never. And how can one man claim the repetition, the 5 times repetition? But he has. You know it's him.
Mm-hmm. How many times does Olive say "damn" in that scene? I'll go count. How did you write the children's stories in the novel? Were they a separate act, or did you get to that point?
One of them was a separate act. The Children in the House was my attempt to write a children's story for my reading granddaughter when she was little. Mm-hmm. And I kept writing it, and then I kept getting distracted, and I couldn't think of a good ending. And to give it away to this audience, it doesn't have a good ending, but it's quite a good story without an ending, which you can put in here. But all the others were written in the story as it goes along, where they came, which is how I did Possession. But the Children in the House is a bit particular.
Did you read it to your granddaughter?
No, she has read this book now, because she's quite a lot older.
Okay.
But she read it for the first time in there.
Also from the audience, you were able to render actual thoughts in writing more vividly and convincingly than most novelists. What are some of the advantages and pitfalls of writing so precisely about what's going through a character's mind?
The advantages are that I've always claimed that the English language or any language can do almost anything. When I was at university, there were a lot of people who were saying there are limits to language, there are things you can never... I've always believed if you just think hard enough, the language can do it. That's the advantage. Once or twice I've had people at events like this say, you leave no room for me, for my imagination, for my thoughts. And I've thought about this quite seriously, because I do tend to think as far as I can into any given particular thing or thought. And I think sometimes readers have felt excluded, and I've learnt to not push it as far as I used to do when I was younger.
Is that why in the scene that you read tonight, you give us a little of the fight, but not the whole fight?
Exactly. Everybody knows those fights that have to go through the ritual.
Unfortunately.
And when I was younger, I would have thought I had to write every word of it, but you don't.
Yeah. The book is about many, many things, and if someone did ask me while I was reading, what's it about? I didn't quite know where to begin with that, but if it's about one thing, it is about storytelling and how we tell stories and why. But there's something very interesting in the novel that Olive writes stories for publication, for as her profession, to be read publicly, yet there's a whole other kind of story told in this book, which is about the family and the family lives. And without giving too much away, those are in some ways even greater fictions. Can you just comment on the role of storytelling in this book?
Where do I begin? They are connected, as you rightly say, and one tells stories both to get out of oneself and to get deeper into oneself, and perhaps to avoid oneself. And I had a friend at Cambridge who said, putting things into the form of a story as an exercise of power, which really threw me because I hadn't thought of that one, but of course he was quite right.
Sure.
It is an exercise of power. You arrange the events into a form so that you're in control of it. And one of the good things, I think, about the multitude of stories that are going on in here is that the novelist, although the novelist is another character, the novelist isn't exactly pushing anything or controlling anything, but just watching. I mean, of all my books, I feel this one sort of unfolded itself. And I didn't realize that the characters were going to hit the First World War until I thought out quite a lot of the story.
And speaking of that, towards the end of the novel, one of the children, Julian, returns from World War I as from the trenches, and he writes poetry, and he gives us war poetry. So, among the texts, you move from children's stories, from fairy tales to very vivid, real war poetry. What are you saying by this movement?
I'm saying there are many ways to describe the world, and the realistic novel is only one of them, and not necessarily the paramount one. It is in the culture in which I grew up, unless you happen to be Wallace Stevens. The poems I owe to a Pole in the University of Leiden in Holland, who was writing his PhD on the poetry I wrote for Randolph Henry Ashe in Possession. And he came up to me and told me various things I'd done wrong.
I see. This is great.
I said, well, he said Ashe had done them wrong and that I had been showing that Ashe was not infallible.
Oh, okay.
And so we worked our way through that.
I see.
And then, and then he said politely, and what are you doing now? So I said, I'm writing a novel that starts in 1895 and ends in 1919. And he said, well, of course, in that case, you'll have to write First World War poetry.
Right.
And I sort of looked at him.
And what did it? How did that work for you? Did you sit down one day and?
No, it was still unwritten when I'd finished the novel.
Oh, I see.
I was challenged. I knew there ought to be First World War poetry in the novel, and by then I was in one of my fits of being ill, so I was lying on my front on the floor constructing trench poetry about Alice in Wonderland. I was quite pleased I did it at all, and I think they work.
The poet is, as I said, Julian, and he's one of my favorite characters among the children in this book. And yours?
I had two to start with. One was Dorothy, who is outside the whole world of the arts. She wants to be a doctor. And there's always a character in my books who isn't the slightest bit interested in writing and painting and pottery. And I always have a great love. Usually they're scientists. But Dorothy wanted to be a doctor. And then I loved Philip, who had that single mind. But then I came to love them all. You know, I got deeply attached to Julian, and I got rather surprisingly attached to Charles Carl, who was the son of the banker brother who decided to be an anarchist. And I got very attached to Elsie. I mean, she's a very firm-minded young woman. And I was pleased when she got some shoes.
Any you weren't as attached to? Or is that an unfair question?
I don't like this, what's the word? I don't like the priapic novelist.
Okay.
But equally, you know, they existed in large quantities at that time.
Yeah. That, actually, there's a question about that. So this is from the audience. My first question is about your attitude to Flood. He is at once a brilliant artist and a predator. Is he the embodiment of a Laurentian fetishist, or does he represent something else?
I don't think he's a Laurentian fetishist. I think he's a driven man. He owes some things to Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and some things, in fact, to G.K. Chesterton, Because when I read Chesterton's autobiography, he was driven to do all sorts of things that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't read his autobiography. And there was odd people at that period wrote autobiographies and revealed very strange desires and practices, almost as though it was a matter of fact, as though suddenly they were allowed to say things like this. It was a period when people started saying things. Flood didn't. He's a slightly older generation. He's the pre-Raphaelite generation rather than the arts and crafts generation. And I don't know quite where he came from.
And also from the audience, creativity in the children's book is a very mixed bag, certainly not a positive force for the families of the creators. Is there a relationship between the destructive impulses associated with creativity and the Great War?
That's a very good question. I don't think there is. I think in my novels throughout my life, the novelist has been suspicious of the creators. And I was brought up by the Quakers. I was brought up to believe there was a higher morality and that actually making works of art came fairly low on the scale of what a human being ought to do with their lives. And the Quakers knew what was good and what was right. And of course, when the war came, the Quakers were there. They went out onto the battlefield and they didn't fight. They picked up the dead and the dying and looked after people. But I don't think the First World War came about because of a kind of new freedom of people. I actually think it came about because of the family quarrels of the royal families of Europe. I think it was a family affair. And there was this German satire, puppet satire in Munich called Eine feine Familie, where all the kings and emperors were dangled about on strings, sort of marching around in blood. And that was about 1910, 1911, before there was a war.
You do an amazing job of bringing the reader into the forces that are taking place right prior to the war, of giving us an intimate understanding of what is driving Europe to war, and yet you do it with a great amount of economy. Was that a difficult thing to set up? It could have taken another novelist a couple hundred pages to...
I hadn't got a couple of hundred pages. This novel is 675 pages. I saw that I had a choice to stop in 1914. And I thought if I'd have stopped in 1914, the readers would never have forgiven me.
No.
Because they would not have known who lived and who died and who survived and who didn't. And my husband knows enormous amounts of First World War history and has a very large library. So what I did was read as widely and deeply as I possibly could, and then pick out those episodes which most moved me and which fitted into the metaphorical structure of my novel. There's a bit at Passchendaele where I discovered that the British put up sort of puppet figures of soldiers, lots of them on strings that were being pulled by soldiers in holes, and this caused the Germans to fire on the puppets and reveal their own position. But I put that bit in partly because there were puppets all over the novel. And in the same way, the clay and the mud in Passchendaele is part of the imagery of the novel.
Your potter is sucked into the mud.
Yeah. And there was a wonderful description of somebody going down underground into an old German dugout, which was written by Edmund Blunden, the poet. And he went down and down and down like the characters in my children's book, Tom the Underground. And what he found at the bottom was a sort of great big gallery full of the wonderful mirrors stolen from the local chateau and a lot of German overcoats and books. And I thought that's like my fairy story, but it's real, so I put that in.
One more from the audience. The Boggle Hole, which both pairs of characters visit in possession, is it real?
Yes, it is. There is a place precisely called the Boggle Hole, which precisely has large stones in it. And some of the local people say the beach is being denuded of stones by fans of possession.
I would believe it.
Who go there to collect stones. I did a reading in Rye just before I came to the States, and a lady brought me a modest stone, and she said, "I've brought you this from the Boggle Hole."
That's a nice legacy. One last question. I think we need to wind up, but I wanted to ask you something. First, I want to read something briefly from the book and then ask you about it. And this is about Olive. Olive had never supposed for one moment that fairies or spirits existed. She lived most intensely in an imagined world peopled by things and creatures that drew their energy and power from other human imaginings, centuries and centuries of them. But she didn't suppose that these creatures were tangible or alive and going about their purposes when she was not making them up or watching them in her mind. Did she? Did she? Do you?
I think that's an accurate description of me.
Okay.
I don't. No, I don't. It's never occurred to me that creatures exist, or that fairies are real, or that spirits are haunting me. I was brought up to be rational. What there is these centuries of human beings having supposed they were there. My father, on the other hand, when he went to where Rizzio was stabbed in Edinburgh, said he could feel evil in that place, and he said he could feel evil in the Tower of London. And I think I would go that far with him. I think if you go into the Tower of London, you can feel concentrated evil, but it's in the minds of the people who've been in there. It hasn't separated itself off into a personified demon.
And it's the stories that people are bringing into the tower.
Yes, and the things that happen to people. So it's a bit dangerous. I mean, it's a bit dangerous not to believe in things. It makes you feel very lonely and isolated and small.
And you don't like small. I think we should wrap up for there. Thank you very much for this wonderful. Thank you all for coming tonight.